at Henduana. She was the daughter of Sargon, who we said essentially created this new political institution, the empire. And in order to bolster his support, secure his position, he appointed his daughter as the priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur, and then also Inanna and Anu at the city of Uruk. That way, if she was in charge of the temple, she could get the temple behind Sargon, but also she could keep her ears open for any kind of rebellion or resistance of the people in those cities or of the temple officials. So it was a very smart move on his part in many respects. And again, it was a way of securing his position. So, we talked about three kind of forms of power: military, economic, and religious or ideological. And so this is him trying to secure that ideological base for power. So what do we know about Henduana? Well, we know quite a bit from artifacts from her time, but also from texts that she wrote and that were copied down for hundreds of years after. She's the first known author and also the first female author. She's the first person who actually signs a work of literature, right? So we're not talking about an official who's keeping track of the number of sheep in the temple and signs his name, right? We wouldn't call that person necessarily an author. It's not a work of literature, right? His name's on the receipt. But the hymns and the poems that Henduana composes are really quite beautiful. And it's the first time that those are composed and someone within the poem says, I, Henduana, or at the end says, this was compiled by me and Henduana. One artifact that bears her name is this big disc. It was broken, but you can see sort of restored. It's in the museum at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. It has her name on the back. Some people think it was supposed to represent the moon because it was found in Ur, which is where the god Nana resides. She was the high priestess for the god Nana, so it makes sense that this was representing a moon. That's a good possibility. And it features in Henduana here in the procession with, you can see, sort of leading offerings. She wrote 42 hymns and 3 epic poems. These are the oldest known scriptures. So these are older than the Rig Veda, which you find in India. Obviously, way earlier than Homer. And Henduana was not only writing poems, but she was also doing this sort of nuts and bolts work of being a priestess. The things that had to sort of be kept track of in the temple, right? But this, before her, we saw royal texts like the Stele of the Vultures, and we saw royal edicts, and we saw record keeping and economic accounting, but we never really saw anything like this up until Henduana. The first time an author writes I within a piece of work. Also the first time someone explored their private thoughts in written words, and the first time someone signs her name. And not surprisingly, when her literature was discovered in really the 60s and the 70s is when it reached a wider audience and the few select scholars who were translating these documents, she became kind of an icon to feminists, especially people in universities who were dealing with feminist theory and things like that. She still is a popular figure in some circles. Although I was reading, and I would agree with this comment, why isn't she known more? Why don't more people know about her? And that the fact that the first author in history was a woman. So she outlived her father's reign and was the priestess during her brother's reign, Rimosh, who we're going to learn a little bit more about. But there was a revolt against her, and she was expelled from Ur. And she comes back. There's actually a reinstatement that's sort of helped directed by her nephew, Naram-Sin, who we're going to learn about. And the later poem, The Exaltation of Inanna, is about this episode where she is praying to Inanna and speaking about how powerful Inanna is, and then asking for Inanna's help in coming back and getting her position back at Ur. Right? A lot of these things are later copies, but not that much later. The Ur III period is the period right after the Akkadian period. The Old Babylonian period is only 400 years after the Akkadian period. So, not exactly contemporaneous, but not too far after, and they're continued to be copied after that point. So obviously people thought they were good, or else they wouldn't keep copying them. And they were sort of good things for a scribe to learn, good things for people within that craft to read. This is a really interesting phrase at the end of one of these long hymns. And Henduana writes, "The compiler of these tablets was in Henduana. My king, something has been created that no one has created before." So cognizant of the fact that she was doing something new. I, Henduana, will recite a prayer to you, holy Inanna. I shall give free vent to my tears like sweet beer. This is when she's talking about being, expelled from Ur, and then talks about sort of how powerful Inanna is, raining, and this is just excerpts that I took out of the poem. Raining blazing fire down upon the land, endowed with divine powers by An, lady who rides upon a beast, whose words are spoken at the holy command of An. Destroyer of the foreign lands, you confer strength on the storm. When humanity comes before you in awed silence at the terrifying radiance and tempest, you grasp the most terrible of all the divine powers. I can't really do this justice. We need someone else, but you get the idea. It's very, very evocative, very, very nuanced language. It's even by today's standards, good poetry. Okay, so Rimosh was Sargon's son, and as we're going to see throughout Sargon's reign and till the end of the empire, there are constant rebellions. Not too surprisingly, these once independent city-states and once independent regions outside of Mesopotamia didn't necessarily want to be part of this new empire. And so they resisted and they revolted. And so throughout these kings' reigns, they're constantly having to put down revolts or trying to take back territory that, let's say, they feel they're not in control of anymore. So Rimosh faced widespread revolts and had to reconquer a number of cities. And he was assassinated by people within his court. This is a stela that dates to Rimosh's time, and you can see that the art is continually getting more sophisticated. You can see that the figures look more realistic. There's more musculature. They look more like real people, not kind of like the cartoonish figures that we saw on the stele of the vultures. He is succeeded by his brother Manishtushu, who also is assassinated. Doesn't have a very long reign, but one thing that's interesting from his reign is this big obelisk, this stone obelisk that records a land sale and also the giving of land, and it shows that the Akkadian Empire was not just leaving things in place and just sort of ruling from afar. They were actually, what we would almost call micromanagers. Right? They were reorganizing land ownership. They were creating new estates, and they were giving land as gifts to government and military officials. it almost seems like the sort of practice that you see in other empires where they're rewarding people based on what they accomplish and their ability, not necessarily what family they're from. So the diorite that made this obelisk was from Magan, which is now modern-day Oman, that we've already talked about. So showing the trade between the Persian Gulf region and Mesopotamia, right? So this is a large legal document. Okay, so yeah, Rimosh and Manishtu had to go into that Elamite area, and they also supposedly conquered an area that had silver that could be up here in the north. We're going to also talk about as well. So Manishtushu didn't get to accomplish too much. She reigned only 15 years. He was trying to put down rebellion and conquered new territory in the south, and again, like I said, he was assassinated. So Rimosh and Manishtushu were not very powerful compared to Sargon and the next king, Manishtushu's son, who is one of the most powerful and longest reigning Akkadian kings, and that is Naram-Sin. Who we're going to talk a little bit about and see also some of the works dedicated to Naram-Sin. Naram-Sin is the king of the Akkadian Empire who declares himself to be divine. Right? This is a fragment of this. I've seen this. It's in the museum in Istanbul in Turkey. It's only about 2 feet high. It's not huge, but it was found in what's now Turkey. In the very upper part of the Tigris River, just kind of the fringe area. You could see it's sort of right here, right on the modern day city of Diyarbakir is right there. So this is kind of the fringe territory of what we think the Akkadian Empire, the core area of the Akkadian Empire. So this was probably land that they didn't necessarily control, but Naram-Sin is sort of making a statement by going up there and beating back, let's say, enemies or people like that, and erecting the stela, which you can see is smashed. But on the stela is that on symbol, sometimes called the dingir symbol. This is that star-like symbol that indicates divinity, and it usually is before names of gods. Now on this stela, it's before his name. So he is basically saying that he is a god, and declares himself God of Agad, also King of the Four Quarters. Now, this kind of self-deification was seen by many Mesopotamians as sacrilege. A few later kings will do the same thing, as we'll see, but typically, even in later times, a king might be semi-divine, but they never declare themselves really to be a god like Naram-Sin did. Okay, Naram-Sin goes up and reconquers those cities of Ebla and Mari that we've looked at so far. This is another piece of artwork from Naram-Sin's time, and you can see the art style and technique and proficiency continually getting better. This is an official from the Akkadian army, like an officer. He's carrying a jug, which only has examples like it from Anatolia or Turkey. So they think that maybe these people being captured are from ancient Anatolia or modern day Turkey. Probably some raid or campaign that he fought up there. But one of the most famous artifacts of Naram-Sin, and one that you're going to read some more about and also have a little discussion about on the discussion board, is this famous stele of Naram-Sin. As we said, stele are stone sculptures, just like the stele of the vultures. Now, this was not found in Mesopotamia. This was found outside of Mesopotamia. Or Mesopotamia proper. This was found in kind of the eastern part where the Elamites were. This was found in a city called Souza, which is now in modern-day Iran. And it commemorates Naram-Sin's victory over the Lulubi tribesmen And it also depicts Naram-Sin as being divine, as you'll see, because he wears a horned headdress or horned helmet. And as we saw already in artwork, horns on a cap or horns on a helmet are one way of indicating divinity or being a god or goddess. So what's interesting is that how did it end up in Souza, right? And it was actually found from levels from about 1000 BC. 1200, 1300 BC. So how did something that was carved in around, 2270 or so, end up being brought to Iran almost 1,000 years later? Well, it seems that this stela was on display in southern Mesopotamia for almost 1,000 years. So it was something that was revered by the people there, and it was in public, probably in front of a temple for, hundreds of years. And then when these, Elamites attacked, they took it back to their home territory as essentially a war trophy. And had it on display and even recarved a new inscription on it to commemorate the Elamite king's taking of the stela and bringing it back to his home country. So this is as it was being excavated in Iran and then transported, and now it's in the Louvre Museum. And it breaks many kind of artistic conventions that we've already seen so far, right? You could probably pick out Naram-Sin pretty easily. He is the central figure. He is the figure that's highest. He's the largest. And also there's the most negative space around him. So it really kind of highlights him. Also, instead of rows, right, we're just like in the Stele of the Vultures, where we had like a top register, a middle register, a bottom register, things with lines, clear, distinct lines like this. Now we don't have that. Now it's more dynamic. We have obviously the march into a mountainous region. There's sort of more action being conveyed, right? Naram-Sin is moving up the mountain. Enemy has an arrow in the neck. Naram-Sin is holding a bow and arrow. So you get the idea that Naram-Sin shot this enemy in the throat. There's another enemy here. This is a group of people that he was fighting against in the Zagros Mountains called the Lalubi. A lot of these outside foreign peoples to the people in southern Mesopotamia were considered barbarians, just like the Germanic tribes were considered to the Romans. You also can see trees that were carved in there, and there's some debate. Scholars have debate what kinds of trees are being represented, what are they trying to represent here. The enemies are not naked and being trampled over, even though some enemies are being trampled on. They're still wearing their clothes, which sort of implies that it's not the aftermath of the battle, it's the actual battle, right? As we're looking at the battle taking place. And we almost get the idea that Naram-Sin is kind of an army of one here, that he's sort of fighting off the enemy, and here it's his army following behind. You can see he's wearing the horned helmet, which indicates divinity. This is the only remnant of the original inscription here that has the name Naram-Sin with that symbol that represents divinity. And this is that later Elamite inscription that talks about its capture. Now, I don't know this for certain, but I've been told that this green staining on it indicates that it was probably in an ancient latrine. Right? This is probably from all the human waste that lay on top of it for centuries and produced this kind of stain on it. Another interesting aspect is looking at the bow. Bows are depicted in the early dynastic period. We know that soldiers had bows, but they come very prominent during the Akkadian period. And there's some idea that the use of new bow technology or existing bow technology and the sort of greater use of it was what allowed the Akkadian army to conquer so many different areas and beat so many other cities and other armies. Because, it is kind of a big question. How is the Akkadian army able to do this? Was it just that they were more organized, or were they better equipped as well? This is a time where we have the appearance of what's known as the composite bow. It's called the composite bow and the recurve bow because it's made of a composite of materials, right? That is, it's not just a piece of wood. It's a piece of wood that has horn on the inside of it and has sinew glued to the outside. And the horn acts as compression, and the sinew acts as sort of like a spring or elastic. And so as you pull the bow back, the horn is resisting compression, and the sinew is resisting being stretched. And this produces really powerful bows. Some of these bows have draw weights of over 100 pounds. Some I've even heard have draw weights of 200 pounds, which means you have to pull with 200 pounds of force to pull that bowstring back, which means that arrow is going to be launched at a tremendous amount of velocity. They're also called recurve bows because in the relaxed state, unstrung, they're in this shape. You can see, so the horn would be here, and the horn would be here on the outside. This is now the outside. The sinew here is on the inside. But in order to string the bow, you have to stretch back the ends like so. And this is what the bow looks like when it's strung. And this is what it would look like when the bowstring was pulled back, right? So it's got this curve. You could usually identify these bows because there's sort of a curve at the ends. Simple bows, like a long bow, would just be kind of a very simple parabolic curve with a bowstring. Okay, so this is a commemorative monument, and another question that archaeologists ask is, who's the audience here? It's citizens at home, probably, right? Is it in front of an important public building? Who gets to see it? But essentially, history is being created, right? It's a narrative of history it's not just a documentation of history, right? It's a complete spin on history. It's sort of the creation of the historical narrative, right? But there are also monuments that these Akkadian kings created in the frontiers, like we saw that little fragment I showed you before, that little stela from Turkey. In the mountains of northern Iraq, there is a stone carving in the mountains that is probably Naram-Sin. Many people believe it to be Naram-Sin. Here you can see, depicted as an enormous person trampling enemies. Right? So here the audience is different. Right? Here it's meant to intimidate. In the other stela, it's meant to glorify, you could say. When you put the stelae of the vultures, right, and so we're talking about a difference of several hundred years in between them, you can see the dramatic change in art, the dramatic change in the way these stela are created, right? So, here's Eonatum of Lagash. She's a little bit bigger than his soldiers, but it looks pretty crude compared to Naram-Sin, right? And here, on the stela of the vultures, the god is the central figure on the reverse, the largest figure. Here, the largest figure is Naram-Sin, who is a god, or declares himself to be a god. Right. Okay, well, you're going to read this article, which I think is an interesting article, and I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a synopsis of it now, by Irene Winter, called Sex, Rhetoric, and the Public Monument, the Alluring Body of Naram-Sin. And it goes into kind of an analysis of how Naram-Sin is depicted and what that exactly means.